or a particular subfield of physics, which is physical astronomy, they don't have any prestige. They are like alone in the world. They need to create legitimacy for themselves. The way they did it in the times of Galileo is by creating scientific academies, or scientific clubs, really, because they did not even own a building and did not have like a true hierarchical structure. They were just gathering places for which different practitioners of different subfields of physics could gather, exchange ideas, talk with each other, and try to develop a place where that particular, at the time, small body of knowledge could be transmitted to new people, because, again, they were excluded from universities. A century later, that's in the 17th century, they began to smart up, and they began to think, well, you know, the people we have to impress is the people in government. Those are the people who have the resources. Those are the people that, in fact, give you legitimacy, because government, by giving you licenses to practice as a doctor, or government by giving you certificates that the product you're selling is good in the respects that you're claiming it is, certificates, licenses, and issuing a whole variety of charters, the government was a source of legitimacy. Scientists understood this and began creating the first true scientific organizations. The Royal Society of London, the Royal Academy of Paris, now, you know, with an eye at impressing the government or government organizations. And they did. They would put their services, you know, at the service of the government, and by doing that, they gained legitimacy, although for the same reason, they territorialized themselves. They created now a very well-defined building and a very well-defined territory, which was, you know, this is what science is and nothing else is science. And that way they gained legitimacy. Does that mean that, or rather, let me rephrase that, does that maneuver affected the objective content of science, the cognitive content of science? No. It affected the focus of science. What subjects are explored and what subjects are not explored. Once the borders of those territories had been hardened, only certain subjects became legitimate and not other subjects. In particular, astronomy gained enormously. Because astronomy, of course, had a long history of alliance with government organizations. Astronomers for the Mayas, astronomers for the Egyptians, astronomers for the Mesopotamians had always collaborated and were valued by the state because, and again, I just used the name of a reified generality, because, of course, if you are an astronomer and you can predict an eclipse, and you can tell the ruler of the state, you know, in 2 weeks exactly there's going to be an eclipse, well, that ruler is a lucky one. Because all he has to do is come out like half an hour before the eclipse, you know, address the masses and go, hey, all you people, you know, you don't believe that I'm the Son of God, huh? You don't believe that I'm the Son of God. But I'm benevolent enough, I'm not going to take that against you. But I'm going to show you what's going to happen in about 5 minutes, starting now. If you don't believe that I'm the Son of God, I'm going to take the sun out. Everybody, of course, you know, back in the crowd, do you really believe you can do it? Who can possibly block the sun? And all of a sudden the eclipse occurs and everybody's like, oh my God. There is no better way to produce traditional legitimacy for government authorities than link the monarch, link the despot to the heavens in whatever way. An eclipse does the job, but also building pyramids that are oriented true north, that are supposed to act as resurrection machines, as the Egyptian pyramids were, and therefore are oriented towards particular constellations, which are supposed to be where the pyramid shoots the soul of the deceased pharaoh directly into heaven. All of that needed astronomers to be done. In fact, both Mayan pyramids and Egyptian pyramids are amazing astronomical devices. It's just amazing how they managed to line them up and line up particular parts of the pyramid to particular constellations that you would have thought you needed telescopes to do that. But just very careful, methodical observation was able to do that, and scientists, therefore, astronomers anyway, were part of the royal court very early on because they increased the power of the desert. So it is no surprise that the first royal science, to use Deleuzean terminology, was astronomy. And that the first big triumphs of science, again, some of them Pyrrhic victories, because Galileo won the fight, but he didn't win the fight in any way that benefited him. You know, he ended up in house arrest for the rest of his life for challenging ecclesiastical authorities. Remember that in the West, unlike in Islam or China, law and religion flow from different origins. Whereas in Islam, they both flow from the Quran. In the Western world, religion flows from the New Testament, but law flows from the Roman law. It is Roman law developed in the Middle Ages that eventually becomes the basic canon of legal law that was taught in medieval universities. So that means that there was a separation between church and state, however tenuous, and that you could play one against the other if you were a scientist. Scientists would always be in conflict with religious authorities, but they could win aristocratic authorities by showing them that their experiments could one day pan out and form technologies, could one day pan out and form something that would benefit the country in a non-religious way. But that means that the focus of science is affected. Some fields of this multiplicity or this population of fields are benefited at the expense of others. And the reason why is that science is expensive. Up to the 19th century, by the way, the word scientist did not exist up to the 19th century. If you were a scientist, you would call yourself a natural philosopher. That was the term. The word science already existed, but it was not really in that wide a use. It is only in the 19th century, with the advent of the use of fermentation in the brewing industry and the use of pigments in the textile industry and the opening of careers for a whole variety of different types of scientists, that the career of scientists becomes stabilized. Before the early 19th century, if your grandmother asked you as a little kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? You know, the majority of people would not say, oh, I want to be a scientist, because there was not a career track that could point you to that direction. Every single scientist prior to the 19th century was a rich amateur. You had to provide your own funds for your own experiments, and you had to have the leisure to be able to conduct science. There was not scientific careers. In the 19th century, that changes. The word scientist appears, or at least begins to acquire currency, and a career track for scientists it stabilizes, which means that now they can draw from a whole variety of sources for their funding, from industry, from government, from engineers and technology, and so on. So science needs money. Science is not cheap, and if it needs money, and those sources of money are in part the government, well, that means that some fields are going to get all the funds, while some other fields are not going to get any funds, and they will remain relatively undeveloped for a long time. In addition to that, we have the question of prestige. Some fields get a lot more prestige than others. Astronomy was at the peak of its prestige in the 17th and 18th centuries, and still is. When you hear discussions with Steve Hawking, a cosmologist who talks about black holes and so on, it all seems like, well, that is really the most grandiose part of science. This particular material scientist that's inventing a new plastic or a new metal or a new type of silicon chip, well, it's interesting, but not black holes, for God's sakes. That is the super science. So prestige was also unequally distributed, which again means that some fields were starved of funds, where other fields were swimming in money. And human resources, recruits. If you're a student of science and you need to make a decision what field I'm going to join, well, you join the one with the most prestige, right?